I'm Grace Whitaker, 29 years old, and on the night my sister married into Boston's oldest circles, I stood under a chandelier and felt the air thin around me. The string quartet carried everyone like a current, and crystal glasses chimed as if the room were a clock striking perfect time. Across the marble floor, my grandfather, Walter Bennett, slipped into a back table, wearing his stubborn gray suit and the watch he's wound by hand for as long as I've known him. People glanced past him the way they do a quiet janitor after hours, and I told myself it didn't matter that kindness would win out once the vows were spoken. Then Maddie swept through the aisle in silk and lace and didn't look toward him, not even once, as if a single glance might smudge the polish on her new life. I felt a small hard press behind my ribs, like a button someone had just pushed and left stuck. When my grandfather stood to greet her steady and soft-spoken, the musicians didn't miss a note, but I did. That was the first second I knew this perfect night had a crack running right through the middle. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments and tap like and subscribe if you've ever had to hold your head high while someone measured you by the wrong things. I grew up in a house where the kitchen table was crowded with pencil stubs and mailed thank you notes, where my grandfather taught us that work should leave your hands a little rough and your word a little stronger. Walter raised my sister and me on stories of blueprints sketched after midnight, of the first motel he renovated with salvaged doors, and of the people who stayed on holidays when everyone else wanted to go home. He never drifted far from the basics: black coffee, a packed lunch, the same gray suit he wore to graduations and school concerts, because he said it helped him remember the ground he stood on. My parents moved away when we were young, and he stepped into every gap with quiet, practical love. He never bragged about the company name carved into stone, just reminded us to say thank you to the last employee locking up. As I got older, I learned how far the Bennett name reached towers that caught the morning sun resorts that filled glossy brochures and, yes, the Vineyard Hotel, where the Langfords chose to host a wedding the papers would call tasteful and grand. I worked nearby as a project coordinator and sometimes helped my grandfather sort foundation contracts, community roofs repaired before winter elevator upgrades at shelters, catered meals for late-shift crews, lines of responsibility that felt like a second heartbeat in our family. None of that matched the world I walked into that night, where the carpet seemed to hush every footstep and the florals looked flown in from another season. The Langfords carried their last name like a coat that had been tailored for generations, and I could feel the room lean toward them the way trees bend to a steady wind. I didn't mind the difference. I only hoped it wouldn't require amnesia. Maddie had always loved beautiful things, and there is nothing wrong with that. As girls, we traced dress patterns in magazines and pinned ideas to corkboards. She'd talk about a ceremony beneath glass and stars, and I'd promise to hold extra bobby pins in a pocket just in case. When she met Chase, smooth voice, practiced manners, a smile that suggested doors open by themselves, her dreams crystallized into timelines and vendor lists. My grandfather kept his distance from the fuss and kept showing up for the essentials, signing a check to hold the date, walking the site, with the manager asking where the staff break room was and whether anyone needed an extra fan during the heat wave. He sat in the back during the rehearsal dinner, clapped at the right moments, and never once reminded anyone whose company name was etched into the stone arch at the entrance. The reception room felt like daylight bottled and poured onto every table, all silvered edges and polished glass, and yet I watched how quickly people decided where to look and where not to. A man at the bar glanced at my grandfather and asked a server if the maintenance team usually ate in the main hall. The server, to his credit, said yes, tonight they did. When the Langfords made their entrance, smiles flashed in perfect increments, and a photographer choreographed the room with a raised hand and a soft, beautiful hold that. Maddie drifted past our table in a sweep of silk, and for a half-breath, I thought she'd reach for my grandfather's shoulder the way she used to as a kid when she needed a steady place to stand. Instead, she kept her eyes fixed on the stage, and I swallowed a feeling that tasted like tin. When the toasts began, the language of legacy filled the microphone tradition, refinement, old ties, new branches, and I realized how far I was from the life that shaped me and how close I was to the one my sister wanted. It wasn't envy. It was a question I couldn't quite name. How much does a person have to pay to be invited in, and what do they lose if the price is respect? My grandfather lifted his water and listened, hands folded the way he does when he's working out the last 2 steps of a problem he's already solved. He glanced at me with the kind of look that says, "Patience still counts," and I nodded back, though I wasn't sure what I was agreeing to. Then, during a pause between speeches, he stood. No hurry, no scrape of chair legs, no need to clear his throat. Just the same measured rise I'd seen at construction sites when he wanted to thank a crew before the day ended. He walked toward the front with the small leather folder I'd left on his desk that morning, the one with reservation confirmations and vendor invoices neatly tabbed. Maddie saw him coming, and for one suspended instant, her smile faltered barely like a candle touched by a draft. I felt the room notice him at last, and the music thinned each note as if it too were waiting. That was where the night shifted, though none of us knew yet how far it would go, only that the next words spoken would leave a mark we couldn't ignore. When my grandfather stepped toward the stage, the band faltered mid-note. A faint murmur rolled across the tables like a breeze brushing the surface of water. His pace was steady, his hand resting lightly on the worn folder he'd carried in from home. I could see the crease in his sleeve, the careful polish of his old shoes, and the familiar patience that never left his face. Maddie's smile flickered for only a second before she caught herself turning back to her new husband. Cameras flashed, glasses clinked, and the illusion of perfection tried its best to hold. The MC leaned into the microphone voice, smooth as silk. "Mr. and Mrs. Langford invite you to enjoy this special evening," he said, gesturing toward the orchestra. But Walter kept walking. The chatter softened, forks paused midair. Even the chandeliers seemed to quiet their shimmer. When he reached the head table, he stopped a few feet away. Maddie's eyes darted between him and Chase's parents, who wore polite but uncertain smiles. "Madeline," my grandfather said softly, his voice carrying farther than I expected. "You look just like your grandmother did on our family's happiest day." For a heartbeat, the room was still. Maddie froze, and Chase's arm tightened around her waist. Then, with a practiced laugh that didn't sound like her, she said, "Oh, sir, you must be mistaken." The word "sir" landed like a dropped glass. She turned quickly toward Robert Langford, still smiling. "I think this gentleman wandered in from the staff area. It's fine, really." I heard myself whisper her name, but the music swelled, drowning it. Robert chuckled lightly. "No harm done. Happens at big events." Someone near the bar muttered something about security. Walter's expression didn't change. He simply nodded as if her words were expected. "Congratulations, young lady," he said. "You've grown beautifully." Then he turned, walked back to his table, and sat down again, folding his hands in his lap. It was the longest walk I'd ever watched him take. Laughter bubbled in small, nervous bursts. The orchestra stumbled into another song, and waiters began moving through the aisles again, pretending nothing had happened. But I could see Maddie's shoulders stiffen under the lace of her gown. Chase whispered something to her, his lips close to her ear, and she nodded quickly. From across the room, Walter's calm eyes followed the couple, his face unreadable. Eleanor, the wedding planner, rushed by, whispering into a headset, as if she could rearrange the moment with logistics. "Just a mix-up," she murmured to a passing guest, her tone bright but brittle. "We'll clear it up in a minute." I wanted to stand to tell everyone who he was, the man who built the vineyard they were standing in, the man whose name was etched into every marble column in that ballroom, but I didn't. I couldn't. My throat was too tight. A waiter passed our table carrying champagne flutes, and my grandfather reached for one. He paused halfway, then pulled his hand back. "Water will do," he said quietly. The waiter nodded, unsure why his chest suddenly tightened too. Dinner began, a parade of delicacies served on plates rimmed with gold. Each toast carried another compliment about refinement, heritage, tradition. Maddie smiled through all of them, though the corners of her lips trembled. The Langfords beamed like hosts at an awards gala, while their guests nodded in approval. I kept glancing toward the back where Walter sat at a table marked Miscellaneous Guests. His name card, typed in small font, rested beside a spare place setting. At one point, I overheard a man at the next table ask, "Who invited the help to sit this close?" His companion laughed softly. My stomach turned. Walter didn't react. He just lifted his glass of water, nodded politely toward the speaker, and took a quiet sip. When the main course arrived, Robert Langford rose to make a toast. Tonight he began, "We celebrate more than love. We celebrate the merging of two families, one steeped in tradition, the other blessed with ambition." The word ambition lingered like a smudge of ink. Our families share values, grace refinement, and the belief that true class is in our blood. Applause scattered through the room. I saw my grandfather's jaw tighten slightly, his eyes fixed on the candlelight flickering across the tablecloth. The rest of him didn't move. Maddie clung to Chase's arm, smiling at the crowd, but the color had drained from her face. The applause faded. The next song started soft, romantic, perfect, and people turned back to their plates. But Walter stayed still, his hands folded again, his patience stretched to its last thread. I remembered what he once told me after a business deal went wrong years ago. Some people think silence is surrender. It's just calculation that doesn't need applause. Sitting there, I knew exactly what he meant. Across the room, Patricia Langford leaned toward her husband. "That man has been staring this way all evening," she whispered. "Perhaps he's one of those patrons who think they own the place." Robert chuckled. "Let's hope he doesn't start telling stories about it." Their laughter was soft but cutting, and I watched Walter's face in the candlelight. Calm, still, the faintest curve of a smile that wasn't joy, but control. I leaned toward Maddie as the band took a short break. "That was cruel," I whispered. Her head snapped toward me. "Grace, not now. You heard what they said about him." Her eyes darted toward the head table. "Please, you'll make a scene. A scene." My voice shook low but firm. "They're mocking our grandfather while he sits alone in the back of his own hotel." She gripped my wrist under the tablecloth. "This is my life now, Grace. You don't understand. I understand enough to know he doesn't deserve this." Her face hardened, eyes sharp as glass. "He built his world. I'm building mine." For a moment I couldn't speak. The girl who used to ride on his shoulders through construction dust now spoke like a stranger. Walter must have seen the tension between us. When I looked over, he met my gaze and shook his head slightly. A quiet plea. "Don't." So I didn't. When dessert was served, someone at the head table asked about the vineyard's history. Robert gestured broadly toward the glass ceiling. "A Langford family favorite," he said, and laughter followed. No one corrected him. Walter lifted his glass again, eyes reflecting the low light. "To simplicity," he said quietly to no one in particular. His voice was barely audible, but the tone cut through the hum of conversation. The nearby guests paused, uncertain how to respond. No one toasted back. In that small silence, something changed. It was a silence that didn't ask for permission, it announced itself. I saw the shift before anyone else did, the calm before the kind of storm that only someone like Walter Bennett could summon. He'd spent his life building towers out of patience and integrity, and tonight, in the middle of champagne and gold, that patience was wearing thin. The orchestra began another song, the melody smooth and practiced, but I could feel the weight of his restraint pressing against the walls. The air had turned heavy. I didn't know what he planned to do, only that the next time he stood, no one would mistake him for a man who'd wandered in from the staff area. And somewhere inside that perfect ballroom, behind the laughter and the crystal and the flowers flown in from another country, the first real crack had started to spread. The band drifted into another polished melody, but it couldn't smooth out the tension that had settled over the ballroom. Every sound seemed sharper now, the clink of silverware, the faint buzz of whispers, the hum of air conditioning that suddenly felt too loud. Walter sat at his table near the back, unmoving hands resting lightly on the folded napkin in front of him. The crowd might have seen an old man waiting out the evening, but I could tell he was thinking. He always thought before he acted like a chess player who never needed to move first to win. I caught the flicker of curiosity spreading among the guests. People leaned in, asking each other who the quiet man in the gray suit was. A few murmured about his place card, how small the lettering had been, how odd it was that he sat alone. The Langfords' relatives, most of them seasoned in social posturing, filled the air with a practiced kind of laughter that sounded like glass tapping glass. Maddie's shoulders straightened each time the sound rose, as if she could keep the moment from collapsing just by pretending it hadn't already cracked. When the waiters cleared the main course, Patricia Langford lifted her glass, smiling toward the head table. To new beginnings, she set her tone light and confident, and to families that understand true refinement. The word floated above the tables like perfume, sweet, sharp, and impossible to miss. A few guests repeated it, nodding as though they'd been handed a truth worth keeping. Walter raised his own glass of water just a fraction. To simplicity, he said softly. No one responded, but a few guests turned their heads uneasy, as if the air had shifted direction. His voice hadn't carried far yet. Somehow everyone near him went still. I remembered the day he'd told me about the early years, how he used to dig ditches during the week and draw up designs by candlelight at night. Every deal starts with trust, he once said, and every fortune ends without it. He'd built everything on that belief, every building and partnership bound to his name. But sitting there that night, it was clear his trust in Maddie had taken a blow even his years of business losses couldn't compare to. The first slice of cake had barely been served when Robert Langford rose again, microphone in hand. My friends, he said, tonight isn't just about two people. It's about two legacies, ours, of course, and the Whitakers, a fine family that knows the value of hard work. He smiled down the table, letting the pause linger. Our Madeline may come from humble roots, but she's proof that grace can't be bought. It's inherited or married into. The laughter that followed sounded polite to some, cruel to others. I saw Maddie flinch just barely, her eyes glistening in the chandelier light. Chase squeezed her hand beneath the table. Walter didn't move, not even to blink. He looked at Robert as though measuring every word, his stillness drawing more attention than any outburst ever could. Across the room, Dean Roberts, the vineyard manager, exchanged an uneasy look with Eleanor Pierce. They both knew who had paid for this entire event, the deposits, the floral arrangements, the imported crystal. I remembered helping Walter file those contracts myself under the Bennett Foundation's accounts. At the time, it had seemed generous, almost sentimental. Now, it looked like the kind of rope someone gives when they already know it'll tighten on its own. When Robert's toast ended, the orchestra started again, but this time the rhythm was off. The melody stumbled before finding its way back. People shifted in their seats, voices hushed. The Langfords smiled, still trying to hold the shape of a celebration, but the edges had gone jagged. I glanced at Walter again. His face was calm, but his hand rested on the folder beside his glass. The same brown leather worn smooth at the corners where he kept his contracts and notes. It sat on the table like a quiet secret, waiting for its turn. Maddie leaned toward Chase and whispered something. He nodded, his smile tight. I couldn't hear her words, but I didn't need to. Her eyes told the story, fear and confusion, mixing with the shame she'd spent the entire night trying to hide. Then Walter stood. The scrape of his chair against the marble floor seemed to echo louder than the music. Heads turned one by one as he buttoned his jacket. He didn't hurry. He never did. Sometimes silence costs more than words, he'd once told me, and I finally understood what that meant. He began walking toward the front, the folder tucked under his arm. The band stopped mid-song. Dean Roberts straightened near the service doors, his brow furrowed. Robert Langford looked mildly amused, like someone watching a small inconvenience approach. Sir Robert said lightly into the microphone, "I'm afraid this part of the evening is for family to speak." Walter stopped beside him, giving a small nod. "Then perhaps it's time for a family correction." His voice was steady, polite, but with a weight that silenced the rest of the room. The crowd quieted all at once. Even the chandeliers seemed dimmer. Maddie's hand flew to her mouth, her face pale. Chase looked between them, uncertain whether to intervene. Walter placed the leather folder on the table, his fingers resting on its cover. "You've hosted a beautiful evening," he said, glancing toward the guests. "Every detail carefully chosen, every bill carefully sent. But before we end the night, there's one balance that needs settling." The air tightened. No one moved. He opened the folder, revealing a neat stack of contracts, each page stamped and signed. "This venue." He continued, "These flowers, this orchestra, every arrangement on your tables, all funded by Bennett Landmark Properties." He paused, his eyes sweeping the room. "My company." A ripple of disbelief moved through the crowd. Patricia Langford blinked, a brittle laugh catching in her throat. "That's impossible," she said. "You can't mean—" Walter looked at her gently. "I mean exactly that." Robert Langford forced a smile. "Surely you don't expect us to believe you financed everything," Walter interrupted, his voice still calm. "Every contract runs through my foundation, and as of this moment," he added, closing the folder, "that funding is withdrawn." It took a few seconds for anyone to understand. Then slowly the lights above began to flicker. The music stopped completely. Dean Roberts stepped forward, pale. "Mr. Bennett," he said quietly, "should we proceed with the new instructions?" Walter nodded once, and just like that, the room began to unravel. Waiters paused, uncertain whether to continue serving. The champagne fountain went dark. Trays of untouched desserts were wheeled away. Guests whispered, asking what was happening, their confusion building like static in the air. Robert Langford turned red, his voice sharp. "This is absurd. You can't just shut down a private event." Walter met his gaze. "I can when I own the event, the venue and the company that signs your paychecks." Maddie stood halfway, her breath unsteady. "Grandpa, please," she said softly. "Not here." He looked at her, his expression neither angry nor cold, just deeply disappointed. "You wanted to be someone else tonight," he said. "Now you'll remember who built the ground beneath your feet." The silence that followed felt heavier than the chandeliers themselves. I could hear my own heartbeat, steady and slow, echoing the rhythm of his measured voice. Guests began to leave their seats, some slipping quietly toward the exits, others pretending to look for their coats. Patricia pressed a hand to her chest. "He's bluffing," she whispered, but the tremor in her voice said she didn't believe it. Walter turned to the audience again. "You may think wealth is measured by who you marry or where you sit, but it's built by what you stand for." And tonight, he said, picking up his glass of water, "refinement won't pay the bill." He set the glass down, nodded toward me, and walked toward the exit, leaving the ballroom bathed in the echo of what real power sounded like when it didn't need to raise its voice. The crowd didn't applaud, didn't breathe, didn't move. Maddie sank into her chair, white silk pooling around her feet, the laughter and champagne and music gone as if they'd never existed. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but I knew this much: the truth had finally stood up, and no one in that room would ever forget the sound it made. The moment my grandfather walked out, the sound in the ballroom seemed to collapse behind him. People stayed frozen where they sat, unsure whether to stand or speak. Waiters hovered near the doors, unsure if they should keep serving or clear the room. What had been an evening of laughter and champagne now felt like a wake. Maddie stood in the center, her white gown catching the light that hadn't yet dimmed her hands, trembling against the fabric. Chase was at her side, his face drained, his mouth set in a hard line that tried to mask panic. Robert Langford broke the silence first, his voice strained. "This is ridiculous," he said, turning to the nearest staff member. "Get the lights back on. Resume service immediately." Dean Roberts stepped forward, his posture uneasy. "I'm sorry, sir," he said quietly, "but the contracts for tonight's event are all under Mr. Bennett's foundation. Without his authorization, we can't legally continue service." Robert's expression faltered. "That's absurd." "You work for this hotel, not for some—" Dean interrupted gently. "Sir, this hotel belongs to Bennett Landmark Properties." The whisper spread quickly through the crowd. I could hear pieces of sentences. "He owns the vineyard, the whole chain, the Bennett estate moving from table to table like ripples on water." Patricia pressed a hand to her chest and sat down heavily, muttering something I couldn't catch. Across the room, the orchestra began packing their instruments in silence. One of the violinists paused long enough to glance toward Maddie, pity flickering across her face before she lowered her eyes. Chase turned on Maddie, his voice a low hiss. "Did you know about this?" She shook her head, eyes wide. "I didn't. I swear. He never told me. You didn't ask either," he snapped, pulling his hand from hers. "You've humiliated us in front of everyone." Maddie tried to speak, but no sound came. Robert was still arguing with Dean. "You can't cancel a wedding in the middle of the reception. There are contracts, agreements." Dean looked tired, like a man who had already seen how this would end. "There are, sir, and they're all signed by Mr. Bennett. Without his approval, the accounts are frozen as of now." Guests began moving toward the exits, murmuring their apologies or pretending to check their phones. The room that had been full of photographers now looked like a slow evacuation. Eleanor Pierce, the wedding planner, stood near the back headset, still in place, but useless. "We should clear the floor," she whispered to Dean. "The press will pick this up in minutes." She was right. At the far end of the room, I spotted a familiar face, Harold Yates from the Boston Ledger, typing rapidly into his phone, the small red light on his camera blinking. He didn't need an interview. The story had already written itself. I walked toward Maddie, my heels clicking against the marble. She looked up at me like she didn't recognize who I was. "He didn't mean to ruin it," she said weakly. "He just wanted to make a point." I stopped a few feet away. "He didn't ruin anything, Maddie. He revealed what everyone else chose to ignore." Her face crumpled and she whispered, "Then why does it feel like everything's over?" "Behind us." Chase's voice rose again. "You told me your grandfather was a retired contractor," he said sharply. "You lied." "I didn't lie," she said, shaking her head. You just what?" cut in. "Didn't want me to know your money wasn't old enough that your family actually worked for it." He took a step back, disgust flickering in his expression. "You wanted to marry up and now you've dragged us down." Patricia called to her son, her voice tight. "Charles, enough." But he ignored her. He looked back at Maddie one last time. "You wanted to be one of us," he said. "Congratulations. You just learned what that costs." Then he turned and walked away. The cameras clicked again, capturing Maddie's face as she sank into a nearby chair, hands over her mouth, her shoulders shaking. I wanted to comfort her, but I couldn't bring myself to move closer. Around us, the remaining guests were whispering, pretending not to stare. Some offered quiet condolences before slipping out. Others avoided eye contact altogether. The grandeur that had defined the night was gone. All that remained was a scattering of wilting flowers and half-finished champagne. Robert's voice broke through again, this time furious. "We'll sue him," he said to no one in particular. "He can't just walk out and pull the plug." "We'll see him in court," Dean answered before anyone else could. "You'll have to take that up with the Bennett Legal Division, sir. I suggest you do it in the morning." The finality in his tone silenced even Robert. As I walked toward the window, I saw my grandfather's car pulling away down the vineyard path, its headlights disappearing into the trees. The sight filled me with something heavy and wordless. He hadn't stormed out or slammed a door. He had simply left calm as always, after reminding everyone what real authority looked like. By midnight, the ballroom was nearly empty. The few remaining staff collected centerpieces and folded linens in silence. Maddie hadn't moved. Her white gown was creased and damp with tears, her makeup streaked across her cheeks. When I finally knelt beside her, she whispered, "He hates me." "No," I said quietly. "He's hurt. But hate isn't what that looks like." She looked up, eyes searching. "Then why did he do it this way?" "Because truth doesn't always whisper, Maddie. Sometimes it has to echo." She didn't respond, just pressed her hands to her face and cried harder. When I looked up, Harold was standing a few feet away, notebook in hand. "Grace," he said gently. "Off record, was this planned?" I shook my head. "He doesn't plan revenge. He plans lessons." Harold nodded, scribbling something down before heading out. I knew by morning every headline would carry our family's name, though none would understand what that night truly meant. Dean approached me quietly as I stood. "We'll have the cars brought around for your family," he said. "I'm sorry for how it turned out." I thanked him and glanced at Maddie one last time. Her eyes were open now, staring into the middle distance, as if the world she'd built had fallen away and she didn't yet know what was left beneath it. Outside, the air was cold and smelled faintly of rain. The vineyard lights glowed dimly over the rows of vines stretching into darkness. I could still hear faint voices inside Patricia, insisting on speaking with lawyers, Robert pacing Maddie, whispering something I couldn't catch. The night had begun as a fairy tale and ended as a reckoning. When I reached the parking lot, my phone buzzed with messages, texts from friends who'd seen early posts, questions from reporters, even a voicemail from someone at the network. I didn't answer any of them. I just stood beside my car and watched the rain start to fall, thinking about how quickly applause can turn into silence once truth takes the stage. By morning, the headlines would do what headlines always do, reduce it all to spectacle. Billionaire grandfather halts, one Balber wedding mid-reception. Socialite bride exposed in family scandal. But behind those stories, there would still be the quiet reality no paper could print one family undone, not by wealth, but by forgetting where it came from. That night didn't just end a wedding, it began something else. Something Maddie wasn't ready to face yet, but would soon have to. Because when the music stops and the lights go out, all that's left is what was real to begin with. The next morning came with headlines that spread faster than sunlight. Every paper, every gossip site, every morning show had the story, "Billionaire shuts down granddaughter's $1 billion wedding mid-reception." Photos of the vineyard glowed across screens, and somewhere between the clickbait and speculation, our last name became a conversation. By breakfast, the phones at the foundation were ringing non-stop. Laura, my grandfather's assistant, stood behind her desk sorting through media requests, her expression careful and steady. "He's not taking interviews," she said when I walked in. Not one. She handed me a list of reporters waiting for statements, all turned away. He said, and I quote, "People who crave noise reveal guilt. Silence reveals confidence." She paused, glancing at the closed door to his office. "Still, I don't think it's silence that's keeping him company today." I knocked lightly and stepped inside. My grandfather was sitting by the wide window, a cup of coffee untouched beside him. The morning light fell across his gray suit jacket, the same one from the night before. Outside the vineyard looked calm again. The storm of the night erased except for the faint tire marks still cutting through the gravel drive. He didn't turn when he spoke. "The papers are efficient," he said quietly. "They've already decided which version of me sells best." I didn't know what to say, so I walked to the side table and poured him fresh coffee. "It'll fade," I said. "Stories like this always do." He smiled faintly. "You give people too much credit. They'll forget the truth before they forget the scandal." There was a long silence broken only by the faint tick of the wall clock. I asked if he'd spoken to Maddie. He shook his head. "She'll come when she's ready, or she won't. That's not something I can force." That night, the television anchors analyzed every detail. The contracts, the estimated value of the event, even the look on Maddie's face when the lights dimmed. I turned it off before the segment ended. Somewhere in all that noise they missed the part that mattered, the way Walter's voice had trembled, not from anger, but from heartbreak. 3 weeks passed before Maddie called. Her voice on the line was smaller than I remembered. "Can I see him?" she asked. "He won't answer my messages. I told her to come." "Tomorrow afternoon," I said. "He'll be here." She arrived in a borrowed sedan, her hair tied back, her face bare. Gone were the diamonds, the polished composure, the layers of practiced charm. She looked like the sister I grew up with, the one who used to help me stack notebooks on Grandpa's desk and steal chocolate from his drawer. When I led her into the study, he was behind the same desk, writing in longhand. He didn't rise when she entered, only looked up and set his pen aside. "Hello, Madeline," he said. She stood still for a moment before whispering, "I came to say I'm sorry." He nodded slightly. "For what?" Her voice wavered. "For pretending I didn't know you. For being ashamed of you." He leaned back, folding his hands. "Ashamed of me or of where you came from?" She opened her mouth, then closed it again. "Both," she admitted. "I wanted them to accept me. I thought if I looked like them, acted like them, it would make me belong." He studied her for a long time before asking, "And what did it teach you? That status means nothing," she said, her voice cracking. "The people I tried to impress disappeared the minute things got hard. They only loved the idea of me, not who I was." Walter looked toward the window where the sunlight caught the edge of his desk. "That's the trouble with building on borrowed ground," he said softly. "It looks solid until the rain comes." Her tears came quietly, not loud sobs, but the kind that come from realizing you've run out of ways to defend yourself. "I don't know how to fix it," she said. "You start," he said, sliding a folder toward her, "by working for what you took for granted." She hesitated, opening it. Inside were several pages of job postings. "Project Coordinator, Community Housing Division," she read aloud. $42,000 a year. She looked up, startled. "The Bennett Foundation needs someone in that role," he said. "You'll report to the regional manager, not to me. You'll work 8-hour shifts like everyone else, and you'll earn what you spend." Her mouth parted, caught between disbelief and shame. "You want me to?" He cut in gently. earn your dignity back, and maybe in time my trust." For a moment, the room was silent. Then she nodded slowly. "All right," she said. "I'll do it." He didn't smile, but there was something softer in his expression, like a door cracked open just enough for light to pass through. "Good," he said simply. When she left, I walked her to the door. Her hands were shaking slightly and she let out a small, unsteady laugh. "I think that's the first real job offer I've ever had." "Then it's a good start," I said. The next week, she moved into a small apartment near the Foundation's Connecticut office. She began taking the morning train, a thermos of coffee in one hand and a stack of project forms in the other. She wore simple clothes, jeans, work jackets, and sturdy shoes. No one there knew who she was, not at first. She was just Maddie from admin, the new coordinator who stayed late to help organize reports. Laura told me she was doing fine. "She's quiet," she said over the phone, "but she listens. You can tell she's learning how to be proud of something again." I visited one Friday afternoon and found her sitting at her desk, surrounded by blueprints and spreadsheets. She looked up with a tired smile. "Hey," she said, "you want to see something?" She led me outside to a nearby construction site. The building was half finished, a cluster of new, affordable housing units funded through the Foundation's community program. Workers were laughing as they hauled supplies, the air smelling of sawdust and rain. Maddie picked up a box of paint rollers and handed them to a volunteer. "We're ahead of schedule," she said, wiping her hands on her jeans. "Feels good to be part of something that isn't just for show." I watched her help an older woman carry a stack of wood planks, her movements careful but sure. There was no trace of the woman who'd once hidden behind chandeliers and champagne. This version of her was smaller, maybe humbler, but real. That evening when I told my grandfather how she was doing, he didn't ask for details. He just sat quietly, his coffee steaming in his hands. After a moment, he said, "She's earning it." Months later, her name appeared in the Foundation's quarterly report, not as a Bennett, not as a former socialite, but as an employee of the month for leadership in field coordination. It wasn't a headline. It was a single paragraph on page 7. But when I showed it to Walter, he smiled for the first time in weeks. He didn't say much after that, just nodded and returned to his paperwork. But I saw the small, unmistakable relief in his eyes, the kind that comes when someone you love finally decides to rebuild, even if it takes the rest of their life to do it. By then, winter had arrived. The vineyard was bare, the vines stripped down to their roots, waiting quietly for spring. It seemed fitting somehow, everything dormant, everything ready to grow again when the time was right. Maddie wasn't the same person anymore, and neither was Walter. Something between them had shifted just slightly, but enough to let hope back in. And even though no one said it aloud, we all knew what was coming next, the chance to see if forgiveness like the vineyard could bloom again after being cut down to the stem. Winter pressed itself over Connecticut like a long sigh. By the time the holidays came around, Maddie had been working at the Foundation for almost 6 months. The phones still rang with donors and contractors, but the gossip had faded, replaced by steady work and quieter stories. She took the early train each morning, a paperback tucked under her arm, coffee cooling in a paper cup. Her co-workers, mostly people who'd been at the Foundation for years, treated her like anyone else. No special favors, no deference to her last name. Daniel Kerrigan, the regional manager she reported to, told me once that she didn't ask for shortcuts. If anything, he said she works harder than she needs to, like she's trying to make up for lost time. I believed him. She stayed late more often than not, helping field supervisors file reports or organizing budgets for projects that most people never saw the kind of work that kept the lights on for families who couldn't afford them otherwise. I visited her one Thursday evening long after the office had emptied. The winter sun had already dropped, and the street outside glowed faintly from snowlight. She was hunched over a stack of files, her pen tapping against her notebook. "You should go home," I said. She smiled faintly. "I like finishing things I start now." I sat across from her, watching the fatigue in her eyes mix with something steadier purpose. The woman who once measured success in designer labels was now proud of projects that didn't make the news. On her desk sat a framed photo of one of the community sites, a family standing on the porch of their first renovated home. She caught me looking at it and said, "They sent that to thank us. Their little girl said the new roof doesn't leak anymore. I think that's the first thank you I've ever earned." Outside, the snow began to fall harder. The wind pushed against the windows, whistling softly between the frames. Maddie packed up her folders, and we walked together to the train station, our breath visible in the cold air. The platform was almost empty, just the two of us and a few scattered commuters. She pulled her scarf tighter and looked down the tracks. "Do you think he knows?" she asked quietly. "He knows," I said. "He always does." When I got home that night, my grandfather was in his study reading through the latest foundation reports. He didn't ask about Maddie directly, but his eyes lingered on her name in the staff roster longer than the others. Finally, he said, "She's holding steady." "More than steady," I replied. "She's good at it." He nodded once and closed the folder. "Good. That's how you rebuild trust, not by asking for it, but by earning it quietly." The following weeks passed without much change until the Foundation's annual dinner approached in early March. It wasn't the grand event the Langfords might have hosted. It was held in a modest community hall on the edge of Hartford, the kind of place with folding chairs, paper centerpieces, and crockpots of donated food. But for the people who came, the volunteer staff and families, the Foundation had helped. It was the highlight of their year. Maddie tried to back out at first. "I shouldn't be there," she said. "Everyone still remembers what happened. They'll remember if you don't show up," I told her. "Go, stand where you belong." She hesitated, then agreed. The night of the dinner, she arrived in a simple navy dress, her hair tied back. No glitter, no pretense, just quiet grace. When she stepped into the hall, conversations paused for a moment, but not out of judgment. People recognized her, and they also recognized the work she'd been doing. Daniel waved her over to the volunteer table, handing her a stack of name tags. "You're on greeting duty tonight," he said. "Big responsibility." She smiled. "I can handle it." The evening unfolded gently. Children ran between tables with plates of cookies. Laughter filled the air, and a local band played soft acoustic music in the corner. Walter arrived halfway through, dressed simply, his presence understated, but commanding all the same. He greeted the families, first shaking hands, asking about their homes and repairs. When he reached Maddie, she froze name tags still clutched in her hand. "Good evening, Madeline," he said. "Good evening, Grandpa." For a heartbeat, they just looked at each other. Then he glanced down at her table. "You've kept busy." "I have," she said quietly. "It's different work than I thought I'd ever do. But it feels right." He nodded. "That's how you know it's worth doing." When dinner ended, he stepped onto the small stage at the front of the hall. The crowd hushed. His speeches were never long, but they always carried weight. "We've had quite a year," he began, his voice steady. "One that reminded us how fragile legacy can be and how powerful it becomes when shared." His gaze swept across the room, landing on Maddie for a moment before moving on. "Some lessons come hard, but they teach us that mistakes don't end a story. They redefine it." He lifted his glass of water, the same gesture he'd made the night everything fell apart, only now it carried a different meaning. To forgiveness, he said not the kind that's spoken, but the kind that's earned. A quiet ripple of applause followed, then grew, filling the hall. Maddie's eyes shimmered, her hands trembling as she set the name tags down. I reached for her hand under the table and she gripped it tightly. After the event, she walked outside into the cold night air, her cheeks flushed. "I think that was his way of saying I'm forgiven," she whispered. "He already forgave you," I said. "Tonight he just let everyone else see it." She smiled, small and tearful. "Maybe that's enough." The drive home was quiet, the road lit only by headlights and the pale glow of snow along the ditches. When we reached the vineyard gates, she turned to me. "I don't think I ever really understood him until now. None of us do until he teaches us," I said softly. Inside, Walter was back at his desk writing again. He looked up when we entered. Maddie stepped forward, hesitant but sure. "Thank you," she said simply. He didn't reply. With words, just reached over, placed a hand on hers, and gave a slight nod. It was all the answer she needed. That night, as I walked down the hall toward my room, I passed his study again. The light was still on, but he wasn't writing anymore. He sat by the window, eyes turned toward the vineyard where the first signs of spring had started to show beneath the frost. For the first time in months, the house didn't feel heavy. It felt settled, like something long broken had finally found its balance again. But peace has a way of testing itself, and I knew the next chapter wasn't just about forgiveness. It would be about what each of us did with it once we had it. By spring, the vineyard was alive again. The snow that had once hidden everything was gone, replaced by soft green vines stretching toward the sun. The air smelled of wet soil and new beginnings. For the first time in months, Walter seemed lighter. His morning routine returned to what it used to be: coffee on the porch newspaper, folded neatly on his lap, a pencil tucked behind his ear. He spoke little about the past, but the tension that had hung over the house was finally gone. Maddie continued working at the foundation, quietly rebuilding a name she no longer expected to inherit. Her small apartment filled with hand-me-down furniture and papers from ongoing projects. She no longer hid her last name. It appeared plainly on her badge, though few people outside the office paid attention to it anymore. Her co-workers saw her as part of the team, not as a scandal. One afternoon in April, she asked if I'd drive with her to meet a new project partner. It was a 2-hour trip to a small Connecticut town where the foundation was renovating a cluster of historic homes into affordable rentals. She hummed softly as we drove, windows cracked just enough to let the spring air through. "You ever think about how strange it is," she said, "that I used to spend thousands decorating hotel suites, and now I get excited about drywall budgets?" I smiled. "You sound like him." She laughed. "Guess it finally rubbed off." When we arrived, Daniel was already there with the site crew. He waved us over and introduced Maddie to the local contractors. They treated her with the same easy respect they gave everyone else: no deference, no distance. She walked through the site with a clipboard in hand, asking questions about cost overruns, timelines, insulation. Watching her, I realized how much she'd changed. Her confidence wasn't loud anymore. It was quiet and certain. After the meeting, we stopped at a small diner by the highway for coffee. She stirred sugar into her cup and glanced out the window. "You know what's strange?" she said. "I don't miss that life. Not the house, not the name, not the parties. It feels like something that happened to someone else." I asked if she'd heard from Chase. She shook her head. "The divorce papers came through last month. No message, no note. Just signatures." She traced the rim of her cup with her finger. "That's probably for the best." We drove home in silence after that, the kind that didn't need filling. The vineyard came into view just as the sun began to sink, painting the sky in shades of copper and rose. Walter's truck was parked by the barn. He was walking the rows of vines, pruning shears in hand, his movement slow but steady. Maddie stopped beside him and took another pair of shears from the workbench. "Need help?" she asked. He didn't look surprised, just nodded toward a nearby vine. "You remember how to cut, I think so. Angle it away from the bud," he said. "You're not hurting it, you're giving it space to grow." They worked in silence for a while, clipping and clearing the vines. The sky turned darker and the first stars began to appear. Finally, Maddie said quietly, "I don't deserve your patience." Walter paused, resting his hand on a post. "Patience isn't about deserving," he said. "It's about believing there's something worth waiting for." She didn't answer, but I saw the way her shoulders eased, the way her breathing steadied. The sound of their shears kept rhythm with the crickets, and for the first time in a long while, the silence between them felt like peace. Later that week, the foundation hosted a small recognition luncheon for staff who'd completed major projects. Daniel called Maddie up to the front to accept a certificate for leadership in field coordination. She stood there, cheeks flushed, holding the framed paper while the room applauded. When she sat down beside me, she whispered, "He would have rolled his eyes at this." "He's proud," I said. "I know," she whispered back. That evening, the three of us had dinner together at the house. No guests, no ceremony, just stew and cornbread the way Walter liked it. Halfway through the meal, he reached into his jacket and handed Maddie a small, weathered notebook. "Found this in the office," he said. "You might want it." She opened it carefully. Inside were sketches of buildings and handwritten notes from his earliest projects, measurements, supply lists, even doodles in the margins. On the first page, a line in faded ink read, "If you ever forget where you're going, look back at what you built." Her eyes filled, and she whispered, "Thank you." He shrugged lightly. "Just old notes. But they kept me steady when I needed reminding." After dinner, we sat on the porch, the night still and clear. Maddie leaned against the railing, flipping through the notebook. Walter looked content, his gaze fixed on the fields beyond. "You know," he said quietly, "I used to think success meant never being questioned. Now I think it means being able to answer when you are." The next morning, Maddie left early for a site visit up north. Walter watched her car disappear down the driveway. "She's finally found her footing," he said. "Took a storm to get there, but she's standing." I nodded. "You gave her the ground." He smiled faintly. "No, I just reminded her where it was." The vineyard shimmered under the late morning light. Everything felt steady again, earned, not assumed. The Bennett name wasn't something that carried weight in boardrooms anymore. It carried meaning in small towns and repaired homes in the quiet rhythm of honest work. As I walked back toward the house, I realized something else had changed. Walter no longer needed to prove anything, and Maddie no longer needed to hide. The same truth that had shattered their family once had now rebuilt it from the inside out. Still, the story wasn't quite finished. The next season would bring something unexpected, an offer that would test everything Maddie had learned about humility, pride, and belonging. And this time, she wouldn't face it as the girl who once denied her grandfather, but as the woman who finally understood what his legacy truly meant. Summer arrived slower that year, like the earth itself was taking a deep breath after everything that had come before. The vines at the Bennett vineyard were heavy with fruit, their leaves shifting gently under the morning breeze. I'd gotten used to hearing the hum of tractors again, the soft rhythm of a place, finally at peace. Maddie's work with the foundation had taken her all over New England by then. She'd built a reputation that had nothing to do with her last name, just results, consistency, and quiet kindness. She was still living, simply, still taking the early train, still walking into project sites with mud on her boots. But now when people spoke her name in meetings, it was with genuine respect. One morning in late June, a letter arrived for her from the State Housing Board. It was an invitation to represent the Bennett Foundation at a regional summit on sustainable development. I read it out loud at the kitchen table while Walter poured his coffee. When I finished, he gave a small nod. "She's earned it," he said. "Let her speak for herself this time." At the conference, Maddie stood on a modest stage in front of a few hundred people, architects, mayors, nonprofit directors. Her voice was steady, her message simple, that dignity shouldn't depend on a paycheck, and that good homes make good communities. No one cared about the scandal that once defined her. They cared about her heart and the work she'd done. When she stepped down, she caught my eye across the crowd. We didn't need words. We both knew what this meant, not just redemption, but restoration. Later that night, we sat on the porch with Walter, the air warm and thick with the scent of grapes. Fireflies drifted across the yard. Maddie leaned back in her chair and said, "You know, I used to think legacy was about having your name on something, but it's not. It's about what people build because of you." Walter smiled at that. "That's the only kind worth leaving." He raised his glass of water, the same quiet gesture that had started everything. "To building better," he said. "Maddie and I lifted ours too." For a while, none of us spoke. The house creaked softly, the vines rustled, and the moonlight stretched across the field. The peace in that moment felt earned, not handed down, not borrowed, but built piece by piece from hard truth and forgiveness. A few weeks later, Walter asked Maddie to join him for a walk through the property. I watched from the porch as they made their way between the rows of vines, moving slowly, but side by side. He handed her a small envelope halfway down the path. When she opened it later, she found a handwritten note and a single key. It wasn't to the estate or to the company offices. It was for the foundation's new community center downtown, the one she'd helped design. The note said simply, "Keep it growing." She framed it and hung it by her desk. The Bennett Foundation kept expanding over the years, but the work never strayed from Walter's values. Maddie led new programs for women starting over, for veterans finding housing, for families rebuilding after loss. She didn't chase headlines anymore. She built futures quietly, just like he had. When Walter passed 2 summers later, the vineyard filled with people who had once been strangers to us, workers, residents, volunteers. They stood in the fields to honor a man who believed that wealth meant nothing without work, and work meant nothing without integrity. Maddie spoke at the service, her voice calm, her words sure. He taught us that grace isn't given, she said it's practiced. After everyone left, she walked alone to the far end of the vineyard and stood where he used to prune the vines. The key still hung on a chain around her neck. She pressed it into her palm and whispered, "I'll keep it growing." Now, whenever I visit her office, I see the framed note above her desk. The ink has started to fade, but the message hasn't. The halls are filled with laughter from families the foundation has helped, and every wall bears photographs of projects that turned empty lots into homes. Sometimes when I walk through those halls, I think back to that wedding, the lights dimming, the stunned silence, the old man in the gray suit who refused to shout to be heard. His patience changed everything. It stripped away the false and left only what was true love work and the courage to begin again. That's what justice looks like sometimes. Not punishment, but rebuilding. Not shame, but accountability. It's the quiet power of someone choosing to make things right when it would be easier to walk away. Maddie did that. Walter did too. And somewhere in the middle of their story, I learned that grace and strength can live in the same breath. If you've ever had to start over or face something that broke you wide open before it set you free, take this story with you. Let it remind you that real legacy isn't about fortune, it's about what you build when no one's watching. And if this story stayed with you, share it with someone who might need the reminder. Sometimes the right story at the right time can be the beginning of someone else's second chance.